Cool.
Roots of Liberty 4. We're in episode 9. This is Joseph.
And this is Isaac.
Hi, Isaac. The name of the episode today are They Are My Slaves, the Judaic Roots of Liberty and Modernity.
Yes, in which we deal with the question, what did the Jews do for liberty? Now, the title is Judaic, using the term Judaic rather than Jewish, because the things that originated in the Jewish homeland and in the Jewish diaspora, those ideas very soon spread beyond them, and when they spread, they mutated and changed like all ideas. So we should talk about, so there are ideas which are properly Jewish, ideas that Jews believed and created and lived by, and there are ideas which are Judaic, which are inspired by those Jewish ideas, and all those ideas find their way into our modern notion of liberty. Just like there's a difference between Greek and Hellenistic, and there's a difference between Germanic and post and medieval. There's also a difference between Jewish and Judaic. So let's talk about it.
So let me do one of my grand oversimplifications that I think I have something of a reputation for. And that is, when we speak about the Jewish influence, let us just say that we speak of the modern time, as you say, and we speak of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So the Jews, before Christianity, are limited to the Jewish people as a people and to the state in the geographic confines of Israel, with something spreading outward, but not so much, especially into the heart of the West. And by West we mean Rome and Greece and so on. But then, with the advent of Christianity, all of a sudden you have the entirety of Christianity, which is a little bit Jewish. Let me actually have a quote by Bertrand Russell. Maybe I'll do it, give it longer justice in a moment. But let me just say the first sentence. He says, the Catholic Church was derived from three sources. Its sacred history was Jewish, its theology was Greek, its government and canon law were, at least indirectly, Roman. So you see, the greatest edifice of the West in the past 2,000 years, Christianity, is in this Russell's paradigm at least a third Jewish. And then, because modernity, I would argue, is a great extent a function of and a creation by Christianity, one would say, or Christian Europe, another would say, but either one of those two options, therefore, to that extent that those two things are Jewish, modernity itself is Jewish. That's for the oversimplification. But when we speak about modernity, this show itself is mostly interested in liberty in modernity, although modernity in general is interesting. So this is why, when we speak about the awesome influence of Judaism, especially on the subjects that we're speaking about on this show, we have this in mind. So, having kept all that in mind, what more could you tell me about the early onset of Judaism and how it influenced Christianity?
Well, we can talk about how we are going back to the Bronze Age, and to the fall of the Bronze Age, and to those Bronze Age states which survived, Egypt among them. Now, Egypt did not survive the fall of the Bronze Age unscathed. It was greatly weakened. It never ever had influence above north of what is now Israel. It never again had direct dominion over anything north of the Sinai Peninsula. And it suffered. Of course, it's a question of how you define direct dominion, but you can say that there were no more pharaohs going and into war expeditions and imposing their direct will upon the people of, let's say, Asia Minor. That was completely lost. And it was also internally weakened, and it was opened to the invasion of all sorts of tribes. Among them are tribes that came from what is now the Arabian Peninsula, or either the south of it, or the north of it, or the center of it, and they invade through what is now Israel and through the Sinai Peninsula. And those tribes speak a language group which we call Semitic. They call the Semitic after Sam or Shem, the son of Noah. And we call it that because in the book of Genesis, when all the nations are listed and they descend from the sons of Noah, Sem is listed as the father of the Hebrews and of the Akkadians and other peoples that all spoke Semitic languages. So it's clear that these people had a sense of being related to each other. The exception are the Canaanites, or the Phoenicians, as they will later became known by the Greeks. But that makes sense, since those came actually to conflict with the Hebrews later, and it's not clear that early history of the Semitic peoples of the Middle East is not very clear, because they didn't write much down. We don't know how and when and who arrived first at written language and at alphabet and at write. So we can't say much of it. The important thing is that at a certain point there is a group of Semitic slaves in Egypt, and they are leaving Egypt, and Egypt is left much weakened. Of course, that's the story of the Exodus, in which the Torah gives us the story of how God saves that group of Semitic slaves and promised to bring them to the land of their fathers, the land they call the land of the Hebrews, but which is settled by the Canaanites, and then he grants them victory over said Canaanites, and they dwell in the land, and they sin against God, who brought them up from Egypt, from the house of slaves, and as a punishment he brings upon them foreign conquerors and oppressors. But since they repent every time, and since he has a deep connection with them, he always rescues them from their own and from the enemies and from their own follies. And this is the story of the Bible. Essentially, this is the story of the nation of Israel, and this is the story of the Jews, because of course Jews is a contraction of the word Judaeus, which is Latin for Judean, or somebody from the tribe of Judah, which is the last Israelite tribe to maintain its identity and its political independence and its hold on the land after the Assyrians destroyed the northern Israelite kingdom, containing most tribes and most of the wealth and most of the power, and only the southern kingdom of Judah, containing the ancient royal house of David and the holy site of the temple survives for 100 years or so, and then it is destroyed, and they go in exile into Babylon, and then they return to the land and rebuilt the temple and the state and the nation. And the question is, because from this point on, the Israelites, the Jewish remnant of the Israelites, will never have full political independence. They would up until fairly recently, there was no fully independent Jewish state, besides a short interval during the Hashmonean period. But the Hashmonean dynasty spent a large amount of time at its beginning pretending to be a Seleucid vassal after rebelling against the Seleucids, and sometime at the tail end of it being de facto Roman vassal. So the question is, the question is, how come a nation that did not have political independence since 100 years before Socrates could teach us about liberty directly, unless we are talking about a cautionary tale? And the answer is because Jewish liberty is not about maintaining political independence. It will take it if it can, but Jewish liberty is focused on the individual and on the community. And it's not the community embodied by the state, but it's the community as a shield against the state. And that is as a community, as the small bubble within the state that allows the individual to live up to his duties and to his conscience and to his heritage.
Beautiful. Let me bring in the quote, or the official Isaac quote of the episode. And then we're in episode 9. Go back to our earlier episode. We talked about Bronze Age Egypt and so on. You'll find it edifying for this episode as well, where we touched upon that. And our quote is from Leviticus 25:55. For the sons of Israel be my servants, which I led out of the land of Egypt. I am your Lord God. So let's speak a little bit about slavery, Jews as slaves, Jews owning slaves. Let me, by way of introduction, bring the story of the awl. Does anybody know what an awl is? Awl, A-W-L, is this type of tool you use to, you use it to pierce things or bump into things, and use it to kind of pierce the slave or make a notch in the slave's ear. It's hard to know how much you have to actually penetrate. If a Jewish slave, who's a Jewish slave and a Jewish master, stays around after he's supposed to leave on the 7th year, and he says, well, I had it so good in my current master, I want to stay here till the Jubilee. Until the 49 years.
If I'm not mistaken, the formula is, I have loved my master, I have loved my wife, my sons, my master, and my home. I shall not go free.
Yeah, so this is a Jewish slave saying he wants to stay within servitude to his master, so his ear is penetrated by the awl. And the reason for that is we're telling him, you didn't listen. Like, when did you not listen? You did not listen to God when he gave the Torah to the Jews. That God said, you should be my slaves and not slaves to other slaves. So here itself, we see in this ritual and in all the different aspects that we mentioned therein, getting freed after 7 years, getting freed after 49 years, this idea within Judaism that if we'll have slavery, it'll be severely regulated. We'll have slaves that are so happy they want to stay on because they're going to have wives and children, and they have homes, and they have all sorts of benefits. So tell us a little bit in that respect, perhaps about slavery.
Just a point that the text, the plain text says that after the awling ritual, the slave stays le'olam, forever, which is the way in Hebrew you say forever. But the Jewish tradition said that no, he cannot say forever. He must say until the year of Jubilee, in which the Torah says that upon the year of Jubilee, which occurs every 49th years or every seven sabbatical years, all slaves must be set free. So there's a contradiction. On one hand, actually there are 3 contradictions. The one contradiction is because you said that slaves go home every 7 years, unless he's an old slave, old AWLED slave, which stays quote unquote forever. On the other hand, you said that all slaves must be returned to their master upon the year of Jubilee. So who needs to go to the year of Jubilee? If it's a regular slave, he would go at the end of his contract. If it's an old slave, then he would never go. So the tradition explains that indeed forever does not mean forever, but to wait 49 years or to wait decades for your liberty is such a long time that it might as well be forever. And remember, human lifespan back in the day were not what they are now.
Nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Sowell says.
Yes. even though slavery in Jewish law is very highly regulated, not only in its duration but also in its nature. A Jewish master cannot sell his Jewish slave to another person. He even a foreign slave cannot be sold outside of the land of Israel to a foreign land, and if he does, he automatically becomes free. No slave, foreign or Israelite, may be beaten to the degree that he loses the use of one of his limbs or one of his fingers. Even if he does, he goes free.
So if he gets his tooth knocked out,
he gets tooth knocked out. As you can see, the Torah systematically deprives the master of any and all ways to discipline his slaves, all the while positively commands him to give the slave everything, and that is every condition that the master enjoys, and limits the amount of time and the kind of service that the slave may perform. So we should ask, and this is, if a slave, if slavery is so limited, is even slavery, or are we just using the wrong term? But this is what we should say. But the question is why? Because slavery in the Torah is either a punishment for theft, specifically theft, no debt and no other condition, or it is a voluntary state, and in which somebody sells himself for servitude. And the question is, why is it so limited? The answer is because slavery is obnoxious to the spirit of the Jewish law. The Jewish law recognizes it, but it's obnoxious to it. It's obnoxious to the Jewish law, the idea that a person may be held in servitude to another person, not because it's find servitude obnoxious, but it's human servitude. The basic idea of Jewish law and of Jewish theology is that Israelites are God's slave, and it's not because of some lofty idea that everybody is God's slaves. No, it's because God describes himself in the Torah as going to war with Pharaoh. He adopts the conventional rules of war, that to the victor goes the spoils. He went to war with Pharaoh over the Israelites. He emphatically won the war. Therefore, the Israelites are now his slaves, just like they were Pharaoh's slaves before. Now, we should ask the question: how does this lead us to liberty? And the answer is simple. If you are the slave of God and God alone, then admitting to be the slaves of anybody else, either by actually selling yourself to slavery or by admitting slave-like submission to a human being, is sacrilegious. Especially as Judaism is a fiercely monotheistic religion, to the degree that everything that is done to honor God is at least suspicious when it's done to honor man.
Yes, and at the risk of getting teensy-weensy little political, a couple years ago, when it was all the rage for people to, bend their knee at certain riots, let's say, and so on, I heard a certain British commentator say that he only bends the knee to God and King, and that's a British one because there are, still the king there, so therefore it would make sense you bend. In Judaism, you would only bend your knee to God, and I think if you're taking that sort of subversive, servile attitude and transferring it for where it belongs, towards God, and putting it towards a person, then you are in fact not just doing something unwise and politically moronic, you're almost doing something blasphemous.
Almost?
You were in fact. Well, that's why I leave the theology to you, Isaac. as we spoke in a previous episode, Isaac has the long beard, and I think if that doesn't establish theological bona fides, what can? So, we will see you again on the other side of the next segment. We're in episode 9 of the Iron Rod podcast.
Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank the galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's love forever reigns.
And good.
Hi, this is Joseph, and we're up to the next segment of episode 9 of the Iron Rod podcast. I'm here with Isaac.
Now that we have mentioned the what is at the basis of Jewish idea of liberty, how does Jewish liberty actually look in practice? Now, the Jewish community, according to the old sources, and it doesn't matter if we are talking about archaic Israel, which is what we will call the period covered by the Bible, or also sometimes called the era of Judges and the era of the First Temple, or we are talking about the Greco-Roman era, or which we should add to the Persian era to this, or we are talking about the Middle Ages or the post-Roman era. Because in all these cases, Jews always enjoyed greater freedoms than their neighbors, even when their neighbors were the dominant political group. And the reason is because Jews believed they were free. And this is a very powerful thing. And what are the practical implications of it? So, in the Judges era, as the book of Judges tells us at the end of it, and at those days there's no king in Israel. Each man did what he thought fit in his own eyes. Now, that sounds like anarchy, a bit like anarchy, but you can see that people did, when judges were around, and judges were not just judicial people, they were also military leaders, people went to them and they adjudicated cases before them. But if you examine the story of each and every single judge, most of them did not have much political power. They didn't have standing armies. They didn't have a court that with officers to force people. No, they relied on armies raised from the populace for a specific battle. And for the authority, they relied on their charisma and on the reputation for being fair judges of human affairs, either in military affairs or judicial affairs.
As far as politically is concerned, I would say this was not an unalloyed good. In fact, I would say politically this is a disadvantage as well. But from the point of view of individual liberty, this is tremendously positive.
Yes, but you can tell how come Israelite society did not tear itself apart. Well, it did, at least twice, because once was when Yephtah, one of the judges, went after a war. He went into a dispute with the tribe of Ephraim, which were angry that they did not receive their fair share in the glory in the war. And the other one, most disastrous one, was when local dispute over the rights of guests on the principal settlement of the tribe of Benjamin caused such an uproar among the rest of Israel that a civil war ensued, in which the tribe of Benjamin was almost wiped out. And this is the conclusion of the author of the book of Judges, that this was not good. His conclusion is that while there is something uniting all the tribes of Israel, which are mostly uniform ethical standards, for instance, don't touch somebody's wife, especially if he's a guest, Um, if a tribe or a settlement protects a group of criminals and refuse to give them over to judgment by judges chosen by the victim, then this tribe is implicated in the crime, and so on. But it was not much, and those ethical and legal precepts which were common to all Israelites, since there was no central authority to refer to apart from the tabernacle of God, there was no. It's very often passion often rose over disputes, because if everybody obeys the same law but nobody can have the final say over adjudicating the law, then you have two people in two groups who both believe that they are completely in obedience with the law, and that the other side is completely wrong, if not criminal. And of course, passions that come in over disputes over ideology are much worse than ones that are merely about interest.
Yes, so hence we have the aforementioned story, which they cut the poor lady into little pieces and they sent her all over the place. This is the story that you're referring to?
Yes, absolutely.
As a way of demonstrating that she had been mistreated and a way of galvanizing support. Which
Let's make it clear.
in the war.
Let's make it clear. She was raped and murdered, and her husband, as a way to rally all the tribes of Israel to his cause and seek justice, he cut her bodies in 12 parts and sent them to all tribes. So.
And then there was a massive war, and the Benjamins, as you mentioned, were Benjamites were decisively defeated, and tens of thousands of people fell.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of the dark ages of the Jews. To give some dates, some tenuous dates to some of the broad strokes you gave before. Let me just give it from beginning to end. So, if the exodus of Egypt happened around 3,300 years ago, immediately following that is the era of Judges until David, around 900 to 1000 BC, approximately.
Which is approximately the age of the Homeric, in which the Homeric epics are taking place.
And then, 300 or so years later, the Jews are defeated by the Assyrians, and subsequent 100 years after that, the temple is destroyed. And then around the age of Socrates, the Jews are rebuilding the temple, and then the Hellenic Jewish age could kind of start, or the flashpoint could be the Maccabee revolt, and that's, let's say, 165 BC is the Hanukkah story with the Maccabees defeating the Seleucids, let's say, and then 70 AD is the destruction of the temple, and then Rome falls 400 years after that. That starts the Dark Ages. So as we're going to be going through the wide sweep of Jewish history a little bit on this episode, because we're speaking about the Jewish effect on history and Christianity and modernity as it pertains to liberty, I thought we would give that foundation.
Yes. And so, how does it look like? So eventually the Jews are crowning kings, but those kings don't really have that much power. Saul doesn't first of all, no Jewish king appears to have any sorts of normal tax system, or at least an orderly tax system, up until Solomon, who actually creates a different division. He divides Israel into 12 parts, but not to the tribes, which remains a parallel system, but under his 12 superintendents, which all happen to be his son-in-laws.
And was this for the 12 months of the year?
Yes, and each month.
I always thought that idea was either genius or Bronze Age, ridiculous.
Well, the idea was that each of them would provision the royal court for 1 month, which means that the rest of the month and the money and resources for royal projects was supposed to come from from other nations and tribes which submitted to Solomon's authority externally to Israel. Nevertheless, when he died, this system, which is very light, actually, if you consider the size of Israel and the fertility of the land, and you would consider that, and the actual amount of taxes that are delineated to us in the Book of Kings, and that each territory was taxed for only 1 month out of the year, it should be very light. Nevertheless, under his son, 10 tribes rebel because the taxes are too high.
Yes, so it just shows to tell you that people are going to complain about high taxes no matter what, the moment they smell any sort of weakness, which they did in the case of his son. So Solomon, and we should say in passing, and this will be a way to bring in another Jewish king that you want to bring in. So Solomon and King David are the greatest Jewish kings. David represents a bit more the passion, the spirit, and the warrior, the general, the conqueror, and of course his earlier era of being in flight and so on. And Solomon, although there are references in the homiletic sources, we only really see him as the king from beginning to end. We only see him as the emperor in security and prosperity, and he's so rich that he's trading in the Indian Ocean possibly, and so on. So Solomon, we are told in the Jewish sources, is ruler of the world, or the known world in his little area. And another king that's a few hundred years later is also the ruler of the world, and he is King Ahab, King Achav.
And King Ahab is some sort of an anti-Solomon in the way in Jewish folklore, because he is very powerful, but as the Book of Kings gives him to us, he's a wicked king, and he's wicked because he introduced the worship of the Baal again to northern Israel. That's which, according to the Book of Kings, hitherto the main problem from the point of view of devout worshippers of the God of Israel is that they are worshiping the golden calves with the founder of the northern kingdom created as a counterweight to the temple in Jerusalem. But those northern calves supposed to represent God the bringer of plenty and prosperity, God the bringer of peace, because the calf, God the bringer of new beginnings, because the calf is of course a young bull. It's a bull that was just born, and of course it's supposed to say we hope that God would bless our new endeavor of starting a new kingdom and leaving the old house of David behind.
The God of the Jews wasn't thrilled with these calves, and every king who didn't so much as lift a finger to remove them is considered as if he himself is guilty of putting them there.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, the early dynasties of the Jews, first of all, the dynasty of Jeroboam, who founded the kingdom, and the dynasty of Jehu, not of Jehu, of Baasha, that came after it, perish violently within 2 generations. Then come a very confusing line of usurpers, one of them lasting no more than 3 months before he's been burnt inside the royal palace, charming, in Bethel. But then rises the house of Omri, and the house of Omri is the most stable, heretofore most stable northern royal house, and it's a very military house. The founder is, as a matter of fact, started his career as the master of the horse, and his son Ahab is, of course, the king we're all talking about. He's the sinful, powerful king, and as a matter of fact, he's so sinful and powerful that when he desires somebody's landed estate, he does something scandalous, shocking, unheard of. He goes and he tries to negotiate a real estate deal. which is simply not done in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, you do not sell your ancestral estate. You keep it in the family. You give it away to your son. At most, at the very, very most, you lease it out for until the Jubilee. But then you return it, and this is an act of deep, deep, deep shame. You don't do these kind of things unless you outright exhausted all other options. And King Ahab, this powerful king, and we know that he was a powerful king from archaeological resources, we found out that he was part, if not the center, of the coalition that fought the Assyrians at Karkar. Long story. He goes there and he tried to negotiate with a man named Naboth. Naboth, the Israelite. It's not the Israelite with Israel. It's the Israelite with a Z, because he's from a specific place in Israel called Israel. It makes more sense in the Hebrew, I promise you. And Naboth, and he asked actually to buy a vineyard from him to make it into a garden for greenery, which means it's not really. He doesn't really mean to buy the whole estate, just a little bit to create a royal park of some sort. And Naboth is deeply offended by this suggestion. How can I sell the land of my fathers, etc., etc.? And he gives him the usual speech. And Ahab, the powerful, sinful, terrible tyrant, does something shocking, unthinkable, scandalous. He goes home, goes to bed, lies down and refuses to talk to his wife,
who is even more powerful and more evil than him. And if you're familiar with a left-wing rag called Izebel, then you should know that she's named after that paper is named after this.
The paper is named
Jezebel, after this very evil queen.
Yes, and she's not. By the way, the reason the Jezebel became a term of abuse to a woman who is wicked, it's not because Jezebel was a particularly she wouldn't be a feminist icon, because she always uses her husband's power, and her husband, who is dominated by her, and she that ended up doing her will. But feminism, by what I understand it, is supposed to be about women going out there and acting on their own. But she doesn't do, but the things she was pushing him to do are not things that's strengthening the kingdom. She's not the reason he was good military commander. That obviously came for him from his father's legacy. His father was a brilliant military commander. And I find it hard to believe that she was with him on a military expedition, but she always pushes him to do things that actually weaken him as a king and weaken the kingdom. Because she tells him, you Israelite, and she's a foreigner. She's a Phoenician princess from Tyre, or was Sidon from Phoenicia, and she tells him, now you will make kingship in Israel. Now, it wasn't the kingship in Israel. He is literally a king, but she means, you Israelites don't know what kingship is. I'll teach you what. So she assembles a court and she hires false witnesses. They all say that Naboth did something terrible. He blasphemed against king and God, and the court find him guilty, of course, because judges and witnesses are both bought and paid for, and Naboth is executed, and Ahab comes to confiscate his assets, and now he gets his patch of greenery. And then he meets the prophet Elijah. Now, let's talk about prophecy in ancient Israel. Prophecy in ancient Israel is, there are a bunch of people devoted to God, and they wander around the countryside and the urban landscape, telling people God demands such and such, God is displeased with you, God, and they often perform miracles for people. And they often.
They are sometimes judges, like you mentioned. Samuel being.
And they are highly revered. because they are, more often than not, what they say actually come true. They prophesy a plague comes. They prophesy a bountiful harvest surely comes. And Elijah was one of the most well-respected prophets, and he is waiting to Ahab in the newly confiscated vineyard, and he tells him, "Do you think to murder and to inherit too?" And he gives him a prophecy that his dynasty would die out, that he himself would die an ignominious death, and his dynasty will die out shortly after. And this is what kingship was under the most powerful king, the most powerful, guilty, and heartless king of Israel. This is how powerful kingship was. The king literally has to negotiate for a real estate deal, and when he dares do something that Pharaoh would have done without even thinking, he have public pronouncements against him, and the curse of the Lord is laid against him. So this is how Jews view kingship and liberty and the rights of the individuals and the common man.
When God inspired us for the fight, their ranks were broken, their lines were forced, their ships were shattered in our sight, or swiftly driven from our coast.
1, 2.
And here is our movie trailer.
We may conquer the land, we may slaughter the people. That is not the end. We will rise again. The day Rome falls, there will be a shout of freedom such as the world has never heard before. I believe in the past of my people and in their future. You are a conquered people.
This is a short piece of trailer. This is the Ben-Hur movie, 1959. I've seen the original Ben-Hur movie, 1959. I've seen the modern one. There is no comparison. Don't even bother watching the one that just came out, although the chariot scene is pretty good. The old one, have you seen the old Ben-Hur movie, Isaac?
I always wanted to see all of it, but I saw parts of it. The book is also very good.
Incredible book. I'm actually middle of it. I read the first part of it. It's significant. One of the lines he mentions there about you're a conquered people, and that's what the Roman is saying to the Jewish prince. This is Judah Ben-Hur, and the Jews are maybe conquered by the Romans in terms of their allegiance, but their ideas lived on during that time, whether or not they're under foreign subjugation. And this show is often, if not exclusively, about ideas. So that the strength is in their ideas.
And besides, Jews have no problem with being conquered. They would prefer not to be, but they don't think that being conquered means that that their freedom is dead in all aspects forever. They don't see themselves truly as slaves to people. They view the foreign yoke as insulting and blasphemous, and it must be a special punishment from God because for their many sins. And believe me, nobody is better at finding Jewish sins better than the Jews themselves. And the more devoted, patriotic they are, the more adept they are in finding their own and their own sins and those of their fellow Jews. But they believe we still constitute a political and religious and public community, kahal, or crowd, as it's called in Hebrew, in legal terms, and we still have responsibilities towards each other. We have fiscal responsibilities. We have to build to contribute to the defense of our communities and into the well-being of the poor and the widow and the orphaned, and we have to see to the spiritual welfare of each other. We have to raise institutions of learning and of prayer and of charity and all the other things, and we still have to live by our own moral code, the moral and legal code which God Himself gave us. That is the classical Jewish belief. And the foreign rule, while Jews would submit to foreign rule either by conquest or because they choose to live in a different country, and they would obey its rules and the good order of the society they live amongst, and they would honor it, and they would give that society that honor which they believe it deserves, which may be very great or very little. Jews would still believe that the law of God comes before the laws of men, and they would never see themselves as slaves to anyone as a matter of principle apart from God. At least that's the Jewish ethos.
Yes. Alternatively, or additionally, the reason why the Jews are not that particularly bothered when they get conquered is that they trace their heritage back to Adam and Noah and Abraham. They've been around so long, so when they get conquered, like, it'll be over in a few minutes, a few eons, and we'll be on the other side of this, and not our enemies.
We went past Pharaoh. We'll go past this.
That is in fact their belief. But now that we said our show is about ideas, what is our book recommendation, which I think has an idea or two that you could tell us about it?
Our book recommendation is actually a very interesting one, because it's a book that was not written by a Jew. Well, neither was Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, it was written emphatically by a Christian, from a Christian point of view. But this book was written by a man that may or may not have known Jews. I personally don't know if he have known Jews. Sir Walter Scott. And the novel is obviously Ivanhoe. And the Jews in the novel are very poorly researched, I must admit, because first of all, Isaac of York, the main Jewish character, is not. First of all, he doesn't cut a very attractive character. He's not supposed to, and he constantly swears in the beard of Abraham and in Elijah's left toe, and all these sort of things that is clearly inspired by Catholic. By Catholic medieval oaths, I swear by God's wounds, etc. But nevertheless, it shows that Christians. It shows that in the Middle Ages there is a moment. There's a conflict throughout the Middle Ages. It's a silent conflict. It's not a conflict that is waged with swords or even with polemics. It's a conflict of two societies living side by side, and one society bears no particular ill will towards the other, but the other society is living in constant angst of the other, and the anxious society is not the dominated, subjugated society. On the contrary, it's the majority domineering and dominating Christian society of Europe that is anxious and unsure about the Jewish minority that lives in Europe. First, Jewish community existed in Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. If the Roman went there were Jews there. And so in many cases the Jews are those weird people, very strange people, who can live in a country way before the ancestors of the Christian noblemen, the Christian rulers lived there. Think about the Jews of France, who lived there since the days of the Roman Empire, before the Franks appeared. And nevertheless, they don't see themselves as Frenchmen or even Gauls. They emphatically say, no, our homeland, our true, real homeland, is somewhere far away, and in the land of Israel, and they do see themselves as subjects of the King of France, but they don't see him as the Lord. They don't see themselves as subjugated to him completely, or even to the local Lord. They see themselves, despite not being noblemen, and they are very strange people, because they are not noblemen, but they are not peasants or priests or swords for hire. They are not even Christian beggars. They are non-Christians. They believe in a religion which is older than Christianity and which gave birth to Christianity. And so it's really confounding the Christians. The Jews are not confounded at all. The Christians are just other people that the Jews happen to live on their lands, and it's immaterial to the Jew what the Christian believe in, as long as he's not a pagan, because that have some implication on Jewish law, and Jews that actually live among Christians tend towards the idea that Christians are not, as a matter of fact, pagan. It's clearly visible in the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam in his commentaries on Talmud, and but the Jews couldn't care less how the Christian order his life. All that he wants is to make his living, to maintain his own little community, and to live by the law of God. And of course he would be a loyal and patriotic servant of the government, but he will not be its slave. He will not live in accordance with a code of morality which is not his own, which he as an individual opposes, and which is opposing everything that he believes in.
So, speaking of these dominating Christians, one of the stories that you brought to my attention is a very classic one of Maharam of Rothenburg, who was one of the foremost of the medieval Jewish scholars.
Yes, Maharam, or which is short for Morenu Harav Rabbi Meir, or our teacher, the Rabbi Master Meir of Rothenburg. He's an interesting man because he was a very, very prominent rabbi in the 10th century, I believe, or was it 11th century?
During the dark of the Dark Ages, 13th century.
13th century. 300 years difference.
What's some darkness between friends?
Yes,
but it was still a very dark place.
Well,
this is Germany, so Germany was still a very illiterate and kind of peasant-like feudal society.
Well, it was improving. Those who are called the High Middle Ages,
Yes.
but for a reason, it was improving. The entirety of Europe was improving. So
he lived right before the Black Death, I would say.
So a certain Duke Leopold of Austria, who just recently took captive the King of England and forced him to pay truly ridiculous ransom to go free. By the way, said King Richard of England, Richard Lionheart, just returned from a somewhat successful crusade in the Holy Land. It didn't stop Duke Leopold from arresting him.
There was official Christian truce that was supposedly observed by many, but not in this one case.
Yes.
That a crusade knight returning from the Holy Land could not be waylaid on the way.
Yes.
And Richard Lionheart was illegally imprisoned, and his mother had to go around begging for money all over England to raise his ransom,
and
which he did successfully.
And of course, his mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, did not have to do much begging. As a matter of fact, she and his brother John stripped the fixtures of certain churches to pay for the ransom. Anyhow, so Duke Leopold, who just made a killing in the ransom business, in the kidnap and ransom business, decides he knew that there is this Jewish scholar which is held in very high esteem throughout Europe, and he thought this should be even easier. I mean, when you kidnap the King of England, there's always a chance that somebody attempts something uncomfortable, like a rescue mission or even a war. When you kidnap a Jew, what are the risks exactly? And so he kidnaps Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, and he puts them in jail, and of course he puts him for ransom and of course the Jews all over Europe starting to collect money, but Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg says he sneaks out a letter out of prison, and he warns them to not pay his ransom because the law, the Jewish law, commands that captives should not be ransomed for excessive amounts because that will incentivize kidnappers to kidnap more Jews. And he said, "I'm not. If you pay the ransom that Duke Leopold is demanding, no Jewish scholar in Europe would be safe. And besides, as we just mentioned, it's strictly against the law, against Jewish law. So he is left. He is left in jail, and he dies in jail. When he dies, the Jewish community manages to pay some ransom for his body, and that's the end of his story. But the interesting thing about Rabbi von Rothenburg, if we regard the administration of a community, a free community, is that Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg issues one of the many legal responsa which he issues is when he says, "It is our custom in all the lands which we know of, and nobody should change it, that in every matter of taxation we assemble all heads of household which pay taxes to the communal coffers, and then they all swear that they all speak their mind for the sake of heaven, and then the decision is arrived by majority vote." I'm quoting from memory here. This is not a direct quote, but this is essentially the arrangement which he testifies and urge everybody to adhere to. This means that the Jews now, urban communes with some sort of voting bodies are not uncommon in the medieval era, but they're in decline in many places. For example, monasteries go from electing their own abbots to just voting, quote unquote, to the candidate chosen by the bishop or by the king, if it's a particularly important monastery, and then eventually they go into abbots being directly appointed by the bishop or by the king or by the parent monastery. Urban communities are becoming more and more dominated by an elite, which is not the same as the common citizen of the city. It's etc., etc. And of course, peasant assemblies are completely made away with in most of Europe during the Carolingian period. But the Jews are all members of a free community in which decisions are arrived at by majority vote, but as a matter of law, and not as a matter of a particular privilege granted to them by someone, but as a matter of course. This is the law, this is the custom, this is how we do things. How do you want us to do things different? Because in Jewish law, the inhabitants of a particular city are all partners in the city, just as they may be partners in a particular business enterprise. And in business partnership, one gets into a decision by asking all the partners, and whatever the majority of the partners decide, this is what is being done.
Ironically, one of the more Christian institutions, one of the most famous Christian institutions in the world, is the College of Cardinals.
Yes.
Which votes by majority for the Pope.
Oh, yeah.
And this is not something that has been the history throughout the entirety of the bringing a Pope to the highest office. I think it only became established in the 10th or 11th century, so you would have this sort of vote.
That is true, but remember that the cardinals are consecrated by the previous Pope, and they are not, and a vote by a college of cardinals, which can be either very restrictive or very expansive, depending on how many cardinals the previous pope had made, it's not the same as if all the Christians in the world vote for a pope, which is not necessarily a bad thing. There is an argument for restricting who can decide who the next pope is, and I'm sure the Catholics have a reason to do the way they do it, but it's not the situation with the Jews. With the Jewish communities in Europe, up until now, always were communal bodies in which decisions are arrived at through through votes, and the executive is always, and if there is an executive, it is always an elected one by majority vote of all members of the community in good standing.
Yes, very, very fascinating. I mean, it does remind me a little bit of the Athenian system, where it's only free men that are citizens, not just all the riffraff. So only people, I think you said, that pay taxes, or at least contributing members of the Jewish society, are able to vote.
Yes. By the way, I said men, but actually women too. We have records of women voting in assembly, if those are women with independent wealth who are capable of paying taxes, because again, the Jewish community is maintained along the line of communal business is business. It's the business of discharging public duties, public individual duties towards the public. And so whoever contributes towards discharging those duties have a vote.
Yes, amazing. That is in part the influence of the Jews on the Christians of this era. Other things that were going on, which we won't get into, which the Jewish messiahs are running around, that greatly confused and annoyed and terrified the Christians and Muslims, but sometimes the Christians. You have the various blasphemous groups that are heretical Christian sects that are in some respects closer to the Jewish original, and that they reject some of the more different Christian changes, such as the Trinity and other type things. You have a lot of phenomena going on, which I would suggest is, does not change the calculus of it being the dominating and dominated part of society, but does make it more complex in terms of what's going on. You have some Christians converting to Judaism, which really annoyed the Catholic Church and the Christians and so on. Also, something not mentioned is the Crusades. The Crusades were trying to go from Europe to Israel without the aid of Google Maps. The result of which is they had no freaking clue how to get there, and they would have to pass through much of Europe to do so. And the crusading armies are actually more likely the camp followers that always emerge in the history of warfare to follow armies who would just pillage and rape and murder everyone in their way. In this case, the Jews. They're talking here the First Crusades and Third Crusades and so on. Tens of thousands of Jews being killed by the crusading armies on their way to Jerusalem. Not referring at all to the specific massacre that took place in Jerusalem when the First Crusades won that city and killed 10,000 Jews, which was the Jews of Jerusalem at that time. Various things are going on in the interplay of Christianity and Judaism in the Dark Ages in Christian Europe. We don't have time to get to it all. Any final thoughts on the subject before we end our episode 9, which we spoke about Judaism and some of its effect in Christianity, and we entitled "They Are My Slaves: The Judaic Roots of Liberty and Modernity."
So now that we mention it, we need to ask how was the idea, if it's all well and good that Jews have ideas about liberty and why they should not be the slaves of anybody else because they of any man because they're already the slaves of God. The question is, since the Jews live in, as at least that's what the historical narrative went for until some scholarship was made in the last few decades, that they lived in splendid isolation in their own little communities, and they have very little effect on the world around them, apart from being on the receiving end of said world. What does it matter to us if the Jews believed in liberty? Those of us who don't happen to be Jews, who lived in modernity, which, as you said, is a product of Christianity, how do they benefit? How does the general Western world benefit from it? The answer is, first of all, Christianity is a product of first century Jewish culture, which was firstly for the theology of liberty. As a matter of fact, there was a sect going around called the Zealots that believed that any kind of state authority is blasphemous, and they were the most ardent fighters against the Romans. And the Jew, in no two communities that live right next to each other can live in splendid isolation. It cannot happen. It cannot happen, especially if those two communities trade with each other. They buy, sell. They engage in business together. They one group at least have to go into the other group to advocate for its existence and for not being slaughtered or something, given certain benefits and favors from local rulers. It cannot happen that there is no mutual curiosity at all, and there is no interplay, and there is no mutual influence.
Not to mention writing books that are being translated into the vernacular.
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, one of the greatest Christian theologians of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, quotes Moses Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the Middle Ages, extensively. He called him Rabbi Moses. He thinks he doesn't mention his last name, but from the argument and from the quotes, which he pulls directly from the vernacular Arabic in which Moses Maimonides wrote, we know that he's talking about him.
I think in our first episode we said that we're going to get back to Aquinas. Hopefully we'll have you more time to talk about him. Definitely
Absolutely.
a very fascinating person. And yes, one of his most important theological positions stubbornly held of Aquinas, that you could only believe in God via negativa. You cannot believe in positive attributes, but rather negative attributes. God is not the most powerful, but God is not lacking any power. Rather, say the second way, that is strictly and wholly Maimonidean. Although Maimonidean probably goes a step further than Aquinas in the exact doctrine. So, tremendous influence on St. Thomas Aquinas, who was the most significant intellectual figure of the Dark Ages, definitely the most significant philosopher, doctor of the Church, and being influenced by the greatest Jewish philosopher, Maimonides.
And yes, and the thing is, so in Christianity, the basic idea is that Jesus died on the cross for the sins of humanity, and in particular to participate in this sacrifice and to be redeemed from the sins using that blood. All you need is to believe in Jesus and to accept Jesus into your heart. So essentially, the Christian believed that that Jesus died for all the Christians, and of course, the Christian would say no, he died for all mankind. But in effect, if only the Christians can benefit from it, which medieval Christians were very adamant about. I understand that there is some dispute on this point among modern Christians, which I will not get into. In effect, it means that all Christians are equal in the sense that they are all participating in the same sacrifice and enjoying the same benefit, and they're all coming to heaven. No matter their birth, no matter their status, they're still the same people. They're still the same they're still on the same footing in the eyes of God.
As Jesus said, and then that he doesn't see neither Greek nor Jew nor slave nor master.
That was Paul, actually.
That's Paul. Yeah, I mean to say,
And
the Christian faith.
yes, and as a matter of fact, the earliest Christian assemblies, which are of course illegal and conducted in hiding, includes people with no personal liberty. It includes slaves, includes Roman women, which have very little amount of liberty at home, and includes slaves, includes barbarians, includes all sorts of people which in the empire enjoyed neither political nor personal liberty. But the Christian thought is that Jesus bought with his blood and with his sacrifice liberty from sin and the grave and the devil, which is the best kind of liberty. So we can see how the idea of liberation comes into Christianity from Judaism. Judaism believes that God freed him from being subject to the whims of earthly rulers, but by making him his own God's slave. The Christian believe that Jesus made him free not from earthly rulers, but from the evil powers that rule the earth, that rule creation, from death, sin, and hell. So, and by extension, there was always this thrust within Christianity, even when in the Middle Ages, when autocracy and became very, very in time and place when autocracy became very, very heavy indeed, there was always this thrust that said that was for liberty, because there's only a limited amount of despotism that can be conducted if both despot and subject believe that they both go to heaven through that believe that Jesus died for them both. And any attempt to impose true despotism can be achieved only when Europe becomes somewhat secular, or when rulers learn how to departmentalize their mind. Yes, on one hand they are devout Christian, but they can still. But that's in the religious part of their head. But in the secular part of their head, they think, but they can still squash the peasants into dust because reasons. So only when we start and of course there's when it comes to that, cynical rulers may try to use and abuse church formations to that, but Christianity by itself is, in the Middle Ages, not the source of oppression, but it's the only thing that keeps the oppression of the weak by the strong limited by a degree, because the Judaic teaching that passed through to the entirety of Christendom through Christianity, although somewhat transformed, gave this part of the world something unique that nobody else had. It made oppression inconsistent. It made it at least somewhat difficult to say, yes, I'm your superior and I'm your master, and I may treat you as I may treat my horse, or my mule, or the dirt under my boot, because you can no longer say it and not at a certain point deny what you affirm in church. And the Jews and the Christians for a while during the Middle Ages pretend or don't understand that they have influence each other, and since they live together, they are influence each other. But this has all come to a head at the Renaissance, when there's a group of intellectuals called the Humanists, and the Humanists wants to return to read the Bible in the languages in which it was written. So, in terms of the Christian Bible, in terms of the New Testament, that means reading the original Greek. But in terms of most other parts of the Bible, that means reading the Hebrew. So we have the Hebraist movement, and the Hebraist movement is the greatest source of liberty thought in the 15th and 16th century, and greatest influence especially on the emerging Protestant churches. One of the most popular books is the Hebrew Republic by Carlo Songino, by the Italian author Carlo Songino, and another book by the same name by Petros Kanaios of the Netherlands, and they both portray a free republic living under the laws of God as practiced by the Jews, and they say this is the state as it pleasing God, as God ordered it. Why can't we have it? Why can't we have a free country? After all, that's what God wants. And how does I know that that's the kind of state that is pleasing unto God? Because those are the laws that He actually gave to a political nation in the past.
All right, let's finish this episode. We're in episode 9. Let's finish it on that vein by finishing this paragraph that I had begun earlier from Bertrand Russell. I always come back to this because of its fascinating ability to profoundly summarize the events. The Catholic Church was derived from 3 sources. Its sacred history was Jewish, its theology was Greek, its government and canon law were, at least indirectly, Roman. The Reformation rejected the Roman elements, softened the Greek elements, and greatly strengthened the Judaic elements. It thus cooperated with the nationalist forces, which were undoing the work of social cohesion which had been effected first by the Roman Empire and then by the Roman Church. In Catholic doctrine, divine revelation did not end with the Scriptures, it continued from age to age through the medium of the Church, to which, therefore, it was the duty of the individual to submit his private opinions. Protestants, on the contrary, rejected the Church as a vehicle of revelation. Truth was to be sought only in the Bible, which each man could interpret for himself. If men differed in their interpretation, there was no divinely appointed authority to decide the dispute. In practice, the state claimed the right that it formerly belonged to the Church, but this was a usurpation. Thank you, Isaac. In Protestant theory, there should be no earthly intermediary between the soul and God. The effects of this change are momentous. Truth was no longer to be ascertained by consulting authority, but by inward meditation. There was a tendency quickly developed towards anarchism in politics and a religion towards mysticism. So, to talk about this early onset of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, and before that, to speak at greater length in the Dark Ages, we're going to return in episode 10. Our episode is tentatively titled The Great Unpersoning, the Medieval Fusion and the Birth of Modern Liberty, which we will talk about all these issues and more. Thanks for joining us here with Joseph and Isaac at the Iron Rod.